Dijon, the centre of Burgundy. Burgundy, the centre of a large empire in Europe for centuries. A crossroads stretching from Austria and Switzerland up to what's now the Netherlands. Merovingians, Carolingians and the Hapsbergs happened to Europe after the Holy Roman Empire. The Hapsbergs, almost emperors of Europe. A Swiss family that over centuries married well, centuries of rule, then inbred, no, after opposing Hitler's Anschluss in Austria, are trying to claim a few £1,000s worth of compensation, along with the Jewish people that they helped get to Portugal. After slowly relinquishing more and more of their empire, they came pretty much from French Comte and were perhaps bandits originally. They certainly had a mountain fortress, the Hawks Castle. One brother ruled Iberia, the other a swathe to the other side of France. Very close kin network. The Hapsburg lip and no sons they started passing on to the women. Pragmatically, not altruistically. And skipping a generation to a grandson whenever possible. Slavery was the backbone of the Roman Empire, which did get converted into serfdom. And French Comte was perhaps the last place in Europe to get rid of serfdom. Even Napoleon didn't truly succeed. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed, landholders gradually transitioned from outright slavery to serfdom, a system in which unfree labourers were tied to the land. The late Roman Empire led big farms to convert themselves into self-sufficient estates due to a trade crisis and labour shortage. Tenant farmers' status became hereditary as the result of changes in Roman labour law that tried to freeze existing social structures in place. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed, landholders gradually transitioned from outright slavery to serfdom, a system in which unfree labourers were tied to the land. In the absence of powerful regional authorities, after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire in 888, local manorial lords held sway in Western Europe, collecting rents and labour from unfree serfs and tenant farmers. Let's imagine that you're a poor European farmer in the Middle Ages. Here's the political situation. You don't own the land you live on, it's rented from a baron or a duke. You and your neighbours share a plough between you and you combine your oxen into teams to till the soil together. There's not much social mobility. Your parents and your grandparents before you worked this same land. You don't even have the legal right to leave the property without the permission of your landlord. You're a serf in a feudal economy. The term feudal is a tricky one because few scholars can quite agree on what it means these days. 17th century historians and lawyers who studied the Middle Ages decide to give it a common name to the diverse landowner-tenant arrangements that existed in northwest Europe during the Middle Ages, starting with the collapse of Charlemagne's empire in the late 9th century and declining after the Black Plague and the Peasant Revolt in the 14th century. Feudalism covered a wide range of relationships. Medieval economies were largely based around the operations of those landed estates. The lands were cultivated with a combination of free and unfree labour. How? Why? The baron employed a reeve, a manorial supervisor, like a slave overseer. Charlemagne had established counties and appointed courts to rule regions of his domain, but In the wake of his death, the empire dissolved. Counts who had received lands from the court of Charlemagne began to consolidate their own local power, exerting control over the people who lived on their lands. They owed allegiance to the church and to the kingdoms that guaranteed their claims of land ownership, but each medieval lord established their own particular set of rules. Slavery was the foundation to the Roman economy. Enslaved people tilled the fields, cleaned homes, quarried, extracted rock, salt, sometimes served as accountants for wealthy Romans. Enormous estates grew valuable crops like olives and grapes. These estates required many enslaved people to run. The nearly 50-year imperial crisis in the 3rd century led to civil war, economic collapse and a breakdown of trade across the whole Roman Empire. This meant a temporary end to long-distance trade of wine and olive oil. As imperial expansion slowed, fewer prisoners of war and kidnapped children were enslaved, and the elites who ran estate farms had to search elsewhere for low-cost labour. Without a centralised economy to lean on, the estates had to become self-sufficient, producing food and crafts without outside aid, and with a reduced quality that specialism enabled. As city economies crumbled, lower-class plebeians from the city emigrated to the countryside and entered into a new kind of labour agreement with the landholders. Neither entirely enslaved nor truly free, these former city dwellers were called Coloni. Coloni were sharecropper farmers. They didn't own their land, they rented it from a landowner in exchange for a portion of the harvest produced in their fields. This labour system emerged. Roman emperors created laws that bound the Coloni to the land and made their status hereditary. It passed from parent to child. Coloni could marry, but they couldn't marry non-Coloni. They could not leave the land to which they were assigned. They could not file suit against the landlords. This system and these restrictions would eventually become known as serfdom. Similar systems emerged independently throughout several different societies, and slightly different variations of units of measurement were adopted in each individual town throughout France and Europe. There are important distinctions between slavery and serfdom. Slavery describes a system in which a person can be bought and sold as property. Enslaved people were not considered human beings with rights. A contract included: a sale once completed should not be altered unless a defect is found which the vendor has concealed in the slave or horse or the other livestock sold, for animals have defects which a vendor can sometimes conceal. Classifying enslaved people, be they men, women or children, as livestock was typical at the time. This was law. Serfs, however, were legally people, though they had far fewer rights than free peasants, who were poor farmers of low social status. Serfs' movements were constrained, their property rights were limited, and they owed rents of all sorts to their landlords. If you live in flats rather than the freehold building now, you perhaps know a little bit of this. Germanic peoples overtook the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, and this is when the Austrian Swiss barons were consolidating their lands into Burgundy, the Carolingian Holy Roman Empire lands. Many imperial institutions began to crumble. Competing powers and interests destroyed traditional trade routes between parts of the Roman Empire. Elites, whether through skill in combat or other political power, controlled the land and the people who lived on it. The Roman estate farms did not disappear, but the land changed hands and purposes. Landowners switched from growing grapes and olives for export to producing grain and animals for survival. The heart of the Holy Roman Empire, France and Spain, continued, and what was to become Italy, for longer. Like the Roman Coloni before them, medieval peasants or serfs could own property and marry, but there were restrictions on their rights. Under a rule known as merchet, or for mariage, a serf had to pay a fee in order to marry outside their lord's domain, as they were depriving him of a labour source by leaving. If a serf died childless, his house, tools and any possessions reverted to the lord under the right of mort main, dead hands, on theory that they only had been lent to the serf for his labour in life. Tenant farmers, people that didn't own the land they worked, owed some kind of payment to their landlords. This could be a portion of the harvest, days of labour in the lord's own field, demesne, like a demise, or money. The amount and type of payment was not influenced by market forces. It was coercive or forced. There was no standard rent in the Middle Ages, and tenant farmers had few ways to contest the rent demanded of them. The lord of the manor who set the terms of the rent agreement was also usually the local legal authority. A moral economy where cultural or political intervention limits market prices or freedom of contract was enforced by the teachings of the church. This system ensured that the lord had the right to rule and that the poor farmers were entitled to his protection. Prices were established by a sense of what was just. There were, for example, biblical prohibitions against charging interest that were enforced during the medieval feudal period. When the shared values of the community were broken, the peasants rejected the system and revolted. Then the community itself was the chief source of law. The baron or king might give commands, but these were not laws, and if he exacted more than custom sanctioned, he would be frustrated by universal resistance. A crafty baron would wheedle out troublemakers before rabble-rousing got out of hand. Lords of the manor were not always nobility. Many estates were monasteries. Even to them a serf would pay 3 kinds of rent. Monetary, he would pay his labour, and rent in the form of food. He worked for someone else 3 days a week, apart from religious holidays. Yes, in Burgundy, grapes and wine were a payment. Commonly a bushel of wheat, 18 sheaves of oat, 3 hens, a rooster, plus eggs every year. Was there any benefit in serfdom? It sort of seems like that today when the common land has been taken and the roads have been taxed, but then taxed again in parking. Charlemagne's unified rule brought peace, but that guarantee was gone. The serfs needed a lord's protection. In the absence of a strong centralised government, the threat of violence lurked everywhere, from French Comte bandits and the armed bands of other warlords. In exchange for tending a lord's demise, a serf would expect the lord's private army to protect him. The lords needed the serfs as well. Labour shortages caused by war and disease limited the available workforce in Western Europe. This is part of why the terms of serfdom constrained a peasant's right to resettle. It maintained a labour pool for the lordly classes, the barbarian codes of the early Austrian Hapsbergs. There was church law and Roman property ordinances. Some labour practices were relatively standard. The unfree farming that elite landlords oversaw sustained the military units that protected their estates and the people who worked on them. The wealth generated by these feudal estates powered the Crusades, and following the Black Death and the peasant revolt would begin to concentrate in the peasant class. This would lead to artisan specialisation, the growth of cities again, and a desire for goods from far-off places. Those factors together would lead to the rise of guild economies, the Renaissance, and the colonial voyages of discovery. It was a period of full employment that got fuller for the survivors, and as that full employment flourished, it brought us all out of the dark ages of the crusades and proxy crusades in the Holy Land. The model was reproduced all over the New World. People, and they were people, were brought over in indentured servitude, serfdom, for a limited time period, but in the mountains of French Comte it never really matured to that temporary status. Landlocked enclaves rather than colonial enclaves linked by the great ocean routes of the 7 oceans. cheerfully amoral, lampooning, opera bouffe, libretto, French comte. A thief is a basic principle of society rather than an aberration. Everybody steals according to their position in society. The law enforcers were bumbling and wore exaggerated uniform costumes. The brigands assemble at dawn. Some of them complain that they can't live properly on their rewards of their work. Their leader promised an imminent profitable venture. There's to be a marriage between a princess and a duke in Dijon in Burgundy. The brigand chieftain had led a raid to a local farm and they've been holding out in the farmhouse. His daughter falls for the local farmer, who's brought in before the chief and asks for her hand in marriage and to join the gang, the band. The brigand chief agrees if he proves himself. He's bewitched and is losing his way. The princess's marriage, of course, has a large dowry and a debt paid off. Spanish gold. There's an intermediary, a messenger, with a portrait of the princess, but the farmer does a switcheroo with the portrait for one of his betrothed, the brigand's daughter. In a border hotel, the brigands take the staff and replace them, disguising themselves as cooks and waiters. The brigands disguised overcome the princess's security entourage, dress up in their clothes, after the busy brigand's daughter tempts them into bed at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Others in the security detail in the cellar, helping themselves to the wine. The real innkeeper escapes and calls for help, but everyone's too inebriated, loved up and tied up. The Duke of Burgundy is saying goodbye to his mistresses in his last moments before getting married. He'd once been assisted by a mountain girl. The portrait reminded him of that peasant. He didn't know that his treasurer had been spending his money on women. The dowry embezzled away. The delegation of disguised bandits arrives and makes their presentation of the disguised daughter. But it all kicks off when the disappeared dowry is discovered. But the Spanish entourage, the proper princess, the innkeeper and the police and Burgundian forces turn up. They've caught them up. While the real princess introduces herself, the brigand's daughter changes back into her peasant girl clothes that she'd first met the Duke of Dijon in wearing up in the mountains and helped him escape from the brigand, her father. You do have to suspend belief a little bit at the coincidence. The Duke had already recognised the mountain peasant girl that he'd hankered after so much, wanting to repay her in kindness. But when she does another change of clothes, it saves the whole band of brigands. The Duke of Burgundy decides to call an amnesty, and in return, outnumbered, all the brigands decide to lead good and respectable lives from then on. Hurrah, the end. It doesn't say how the lifelong bandits suddenly managed to get trades, a job. There's no mention of, the Duke marries the peasant girl instead of the princess. None of that. You have to remember that the same writer of plays didn't usually have anything like as much story in his other works. It was all about the changes of clothes, all performed in front of the audience. Storyline and music and singing really brought up the quality of music hall titillation. Supposedly this big budget show inspired Bizet. Have you seen any shows recently that have very little storyline? Quite a lot of undressing and a few quirky costumes? Please, in the comments, don't tell us about them. Happened to Europe after Holy Roman Empire. The Hapsbergs, almost emperors of Europe. A Swiss family, pretty much from French Compton, were perhaps bandits originally. They certainly had a mountain fortress, the Hawks Castle. One brother ruled Iberia, the other a swathe to the other side of France. Very close kin network. The Hapsburg lip, and no sons, they started passing on to the women. pragmatically, not altruistically, and skipping a generation to a grandson whenever possible. Slave. Le Brigand of the French Comte is still alive today. 4 tons of Comte cheese have been kidnapped by cheese bandits. In the Belle Epoque period, the acclaimed handlebar moustache Jules Bonneau of Haute-Fourneau in Doubs, the Pointe de Roide criminal after him, and in the 1940s and 50s, Les Brigandes de Tigre portrayed on television. What would you do if orphaned by your mother at 11? Go fish illegally with 2 friends and get 125 grams of fish. But that gets you at 15 years old in front of the Montbéliard court. A bit harsh, you might think, but then so is a life where your brother commits suicide, your daughter of 4 days old goes missing. He gets dismissed from several factories and is separated from his wife. A life of banditry is for him quite a short life. 1912 in Choisy-le-Roi. Him and his gang, not just his gang, they were all known as the Tragic Bandits. For a death sentence, it was usual to transfer them to Paris, but they die on the way, somehow. Jacques Offenbach played into popular sentiment with his cheerfully
place pour ne pas en prendre pour 20 ans.